Please join me in welcoming the host for tonight, Ted Turner.
That intro was bigger than my intro. Thank you very much. That was really nice. And thank you all for being here this evening for this very special event to hear from our good friend Andy Young and his godson, Kabir Sehgal. I've been practicing that all day. I think I got it right. I've admired Andy for many years, like we all have, and I'm not surprised that someone like Kabir would want to document a conversation with him. Andy's an inspiration to all of us, and we thank Kabir for reminding us just how extraordinary Andy is. Thank you again for being here tonight. It's going to be a terrific program, and now it's my pleasure to turn it back to Patricia Whitfield. I should have given her, she's a local TV anchor. Patricia, come on out.
I think everybody in their life has probably had a parent or a grandparent or a teacher or a godparent who you've had an extraordinary conversation with over the years, a relationship with. Gentlemen, you can go ahead and have a seat. And there's been a sharing of life lessons along the way. You don't always necessarily agree, but you have a beautiful, fulfilling relationship and dialogue. Well, that's what you're about to witness this evening with Kabir and Ambassador Young, a 20-year conversation documented in this book. And this evening we're going to get an idea of how this came to fruition, where this started, and what the most powerful lessons between the both of you were along the way. And of course, we're going to entertain a lot of your questions in the end as well. All right, gentlemen, so first of all, where did this come from? Whose idea was this, that you would have 20 years of conversation over your lifetimes and decide to put this in the form of a book?
Well, I decided that we would talk, because I always talk to young people. Your own children don't listen to you, so you talk to other people's children. and I think it was more his idea that it was worth recording. In fact, you got the idea from Doug Brinkley, the historian, who was a friend of his down in New Orleans in the wake of Katrina, where Kabir was doing some work in particular philanthropy for jazz musicians and helping them get reestablished in the city.
So Kabir, how did you record these conversations? At what point did you say, wait a minute, I'm getting all this great information, whether it be about Andy Young's life or whether it be about how I approach my life? Because he shared so much that helped you kind of craft your own journey, make it your own, and listen to the many voices, including your inner voice and those outer voices along the way.
The book kind of took form. Doug Brinkley did tell us to get together, but it wasn't actually as easy as that, because I was talking to Doug. I was in New Orleans, and he said, Kabir, you've got a great relationship with your uncle Andy, Andrew Young, but there might be some hiccups if you do a book with him. And I said, well, what are the hiccups? And he said, well, he has a tendency to speak unvarnished, curse a little bit, which was captured in the book. And then he said something that I didn't really think about. He said, Kabir, if you do a book with Ambassador Young, you're going to make a lot of enemies. And I said, this is strange. I know this great man, he's a mayor, he's beloved. He said, by the time you're done with this book, the New York Times won't like you. Some people who were kind of against him during his political days were against him. So as I wrote this book and was working with Andy, I was able to kind of put that on one side and ask him questions about this and say, why is it? Explain the difficult times he went through. And I was able to kind of go off that and use the lessons he learned in his life and applied it to mine.
So everything from being born in a segregated South to getting through public schools. There's a great section there about public schools versus private schools, which I really enjoyed reading too. to going to Howard University, yay Bison, I'm a graduate of Howard U as well, Washington, D.C., becoming a congressman, a UN ambassador, the man who would help almost single-handedly get Olympic Games to Atlanta, and a host of other things along the way. But how is it? I mean, how did you receive that to hear that there might be enemies when these were all incredible positive things?
Well, I feel, if you're out there doing great things, you're often inviting a lot of criticism. And I'm looking right now at one of my, wonderful people who's joined us today, Max Cleland. And Max Cleland, I think, thank you for joining us today. I was delighted to see you. Just want to thanks. And Max was the reason I got hooked up with Doug Brinkley, because we were on the Kerry campaign. And we all know what, tomorrow's an election day, but we all know the criticism Max took. But you'd probably say, I'm going to paraphrase, that you wouldn't have, the criticism you got is because you had reached such a defining position in our society. And when you reach the top, you sometimes get criticized, right? And I learned that just the other day, I learned that if you're too obsessed with people's criticisms of you, that's in itself a form of vanity and narcissism, right? And you should kind of just, in jazz music, we say, I only want to sound like myself. And he helped me kind of develop and find my own voice, and it comes out through the writing, and it comes out through my talk conversations now.
So, Mr. Ambassador, I wonder when you heard that, there was even this trepidation that he had about writing this book. While he was excited about it, there was this trepidation. What were you most concerned about this venture together?
Well, I was concerned about the same sort of thing, because when we started this, I was 76 years old. When we started taping, he was 26, so it was exactly 50 years. And I said, I'm not going to run for anything anymore. I don't want anything from anybody. I don't need anything. The one thing I've been devoted to all my life is the truth. And without truth, well, truth comes with controversy. But it's out of controversy that you get growth and progress. And I just figure, in fact, I said to President Carter, who built this beautiful place for things like this, I said to him when he asked me to go to the United Nations, I said, it's going to be very controversial. I said, I can't take State Department positions and support them when Martin Luther King, my best friend, gave his life changing those positions. And he said, but that's what I want. That's why I want you there. I want our country to reflect more the human rights spirit of Martin Luther King than what we have been reflecting all along. And I said, well, if you don't mind, I don't mind. And I think that Dr. King used to say that it's a 10-day nation. And he said, no matter what you say, for the first 10 days, you're wrong, you're crazy, you're self-serving, you're trying to get rich and gain attention or what. The second 10 days, they say, well, maybe you got a point, but you're just going about it in the wrong way. The third 10 days, they take over the idea and act like you never had it. This is something they were going to do all along, except that your agitation just slowed it down. Now, can you imagine after Birmingham and Selma and St. Augustine and the passage of the Voting Rights Act and all of the things that we went through in 64, 65, including a Nobel Prize for Martin Luther King, that Lyndon Johnson held a conference at the White House. The title of it was To Fulfill These Rights. And they never mentioned Martin Luther King's name once. They never mentioned the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. All this that had happened was the policy and plan of the Johnson administration all along. Well, we were not really offended by that. We weren't doing it. We didn't care who got the credit. And usually the people who stir up the trouble don't get the credit, they get the blame. And so that's been my role, and I've been very comfortable in it. In fact, I have profited by it more than, than is just. In the sense that if I hadn't been so outspoken, nobody would have wanted, President Carter wouldn't have wanted me to come to the UN. When Jimmy Carter was running for president, the Constitution said Jimmy is running for what? It was very controversial, and people laughed at us for saying we were going to bring the Olympics here. And I went to a meeting with a group of bankers, and Charlie Loudermilk took me in, and they asked me about what did I want to do for the city, and I talked about I wanted Atlanta to be the next great international city. And all of these distinguished bankers told Charlie when we got through, where did you get this nut from? Mayors are supposed to pick up the garbage and fix the potholes and, run the police force. Well, I did that. But I had a vision of this city, thanks to the airport, and there was no money in the U.S. Treasury. So if we were going to grow this city, we had to grow it with private investment, foreign direct investment, because that's where the money was. And so I had been on the banking committee in Congress, so I knew where there was plenty surplus capital that was looking for a safe haven to invest. In fact, Swiss banks were charging interest to keep people's money. And so we went to those places and said, bring it to Atlanta. You can put it to work, create jobs, and make money, make more money.
And for a very long time, you really described yourself as the behind-the-scenes catalyst, especially as it pertained to the civil rights movement. And Kabir, you had an opportunity, unlike anybody else, to have these conversations, these intimate conversations about Ambassador Young's reflection of life. So while his name is virtually synonymous with the civil rights movement, did you find it extraordinary, at the very least, that it was he who was really the confidant of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and that he would describe himself as this behind-the-scenes catalyst?
I did, and the most illustrative moment in that was when the publisher sent us the book. We actually didn't like the name of this book, but they said this would sell, and
you don't like the name now?
The
Walk in My Shoes?
Because the whole idea we were saying is walk in your own shoes, and they said if you called it that, no one wants to walk in their own shoes. They want to buy the book and walk in your shoes, right? So we said okay. But then they gave us a cover, and the cover was a picture of Dr. King and Young on the cover, and it was not a very good picture. You were in the back, and I called you and I said, "Is there a better picture of you with Dr. King?" And he said, there's not really a lot of pictures with me and Dr. King. There's some grainy ones, there's some ones black and white. I have to hunt around for some. And that to me was extraordinary, because you think of him as synonymous with the civil rights movement, and I write in there, I said he thought of himself as a number two to many things, and that's why, just by his accomplishments, people thought of him as a great number one and elevated him to different positions of power. And
so what did that teach you?
That taught me, and I wish I had learned that. On my college graduation day, he came up, and Carolyn came up to Hanover, and he gave me a letter. And in that letter, I opened it. I was hoping it would be money. And we actually have we have a tradition in the Indian households that there's money inside of it. But it wasn't. But it was actually better than money, because he said, "Dear Kabir, you're great. You're really, really complimentary." But the thing I remember at the end of the letter, it said, "Kabir, you can do anything you want in your life, as long as you give other people credit." Right? As long as you give other people credit. And going into college, I was hustling and trying to get credit for it and put myself out there. And at the end of college and going into my current job, I work on Wall Street now, I've learned it's okay not to be out there on the stage. I guess I'm on the stage right now, but it's much better to be in the back. And if you don't confuse yourself with the idea and who owns the idea, you can get a lot more done. I remember that story about Carnegie went to Pullman, and Pullman said, let's merge our companies. And Carnegie said, well, we're going to name the company Pullman Carnegie, right? And because his name came first, Pullman said, okay, let's do it. And I've learned that vanity it may be a sin. Is it one of the seven deadly sins? Vanity and greed, and to avoid these things. And he's really taught me that it's okay to be in the shadows.
Well, I'm wondering, when you wrote that note, did you think, okay, I'm going through this exercise, and I get it, this generation probably, he's going to dismiss it, or did you feel like you knew Kabir well enough to say, you know what, I think this is going to stick with him, or maybe later he'll get it?
No, it was something that Martin Luther King had on his desk. There's no limit to what you can do if you don't mind who gets the credit. And then I heard that Mr. Woodruff at Coca-Cola had the same kind of sign on his desk. And it just seemed to me to be a mantra for success. Martin Luther King got credit for the March on Washington, but he tried to give it to everybody else. I mean, they didn't even want him to be, well, at that time, everybody wanted to speak first, because you figure if you speak before 12 o'clock, you get on the 6 o'clock news. So everybody wanted to speak first, and he didn't care. He said, all right. And, it was 6:30 when he got up, and the 6 o'clock news was already off. But nobody knows anything that happened there but the fact that he made that speech. And they were arguing with him about the time. And each one was supposed to have 9 minutes. He took his 9 minutes, and his written speech was 9 minutes. But when he got going, and I don't remember this, but he had talked about this dream in Detroit. And there's a apocryphal story that Mahalia Jackson was standing there and said, go ahead and tell him about the dream, Art. And then it went off. And that's what we remember.
But the part that's not remembered so much in that speech, the speech was called, or the march was called, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. We know the freedom part, political suffrage, the right to vote. And there wasn't a single conversation that I had with Uncle Andy in all these topics that didn't touch on jobs, the markets, the economy. Civil rights was supposed to, and it still is, I think, it was fundamental to people getting a job and helping them help themselves, right? He said, Dr. King said the American Negro was given a check, and he took that check to the Bank of Justice, and it was marked insufficient funds, right? We often talk in metaphors. I spend time with my friends. I owe you one. It wasn't a mistake to use a financial metaphor. And as I kind of work on Wall Street now, I think about what is our challenge in our generation to make markets and to help jobs come about. We're all talking about unemployment. Unemployment is the symptom. It's not the cause. And I'd like to hear your thoughts. We can talk about this later, but on how we get this last kind of mile of the civil rights movement accomplished.
Well, that's really what we spent most of the time in the book on, and that is that the struggle was about to redeem the soul of America from the triple evils of racism, war, and poverty. And I think we've made enormous progress on racism. We've made progress even in war. We can discuss that later. But we've made almost no progress on poverty in the United States. Now, actually, we have made progress on poverty in China and India and Brazil, South Africa, Nigeria. There are places where the economic life of the developing world and new countries is booming. But it has gotten stagnant here. Now, I've always said that regardless of what my title is, I'm basically a preacher. And what I always judge what I'm doing by is what I think you're going to be asked in the judgment. And that is, did you feed the hungry? Did you clothe the naked? Did you heal the sick? did you set at liberty those who are oppressed? Well, by and large, I mean, it's straight out of Jesus and Isaiah. By and large, that's the purpose of everything I do. And when I ran for Congress, it was because I thought government was the way to do that for people. And I began to see the shortcomings of government, and I began to move. As mayor, we did most of our projects with the private sector. There was little or no government money in the Olympics. We built that airport. We've got a $6 billion addition out there. And it's not costing the taxpayers 1 cent. In fact, taxpayers who've got a little sense and are wise about things like this are investing in Atlanta airport municipal bonds. And even during the economic crisis, when everything else was losing money, those bonds were paying 6 to 8% tax exempt. And so that was a design to generate wealth in the South. It was conceived by Mayor Hartsfield, and I have a feeling that he knew what he was doing, because he gave Delta all the land they wanted for $1 a year for 50 years to get them to move here. Then he bought the airport project out there, which was an old farm, car racing and horse racing place. And then he put up red lights on Peachtree, and he lost the election. And he decided then that there were not enough white people in this city to keep up with a progressive agenda. So he was the one who reached out to Atlanta University, to Dr. Mays and Dr. Rufus Clements and the whole AU, Daddy King, and you form this business community black intellectual coalition that has really run this city since Hartsfield lost that first election. But it was a very conscious effort to create economic growth, to create jobs, which feed the hungry and clothe the naked and heal the sick.
So Uncle Andy's life mission and his commitment to eradicating these triple evils, and especially the latter, how much did that influence the route that you would take in economics? Now you're at JP Morgan in New York, and I wonder, these conversations along the years, you could have gone to politics. There are so many different persuasions in which you could have gone to follow in his footsteps. You chose economics. How influential was this dialogue to that decision?
Very, very influential. And I chose my path because one of the big messages in our conversations is you really got to start where you are. You know, I'm not Mark Zuckerberg. I didn't create Facebook, but I am actually very interested in jazz music. I'm a jazz musician. And I was down in New Orleans after Katrina, and we started a little charity that helps. We raised a lot of money. We would help musicians come back to the city. Now, that was great. We kept on running out of money. But Uncle Andy showed up. I was just thinking about what he was saying, and he said, help people help themselves, create a macroeconomic solution. So we're sitting around thinking of how can we make this sustainable. So we created this website. You go to the website, you can book a jazz musician online. It's like Priceline for jazz music. And then we generate a small 5 to 10% commission. And all those commissions go down to New Orleans to help kids get off the street into after-school jazz charities. Right? So it's not me going around and begging for money, but it's not the civil rights movement as we know it, because I don't really think we're going to have another civil rights movement that's a carbon copy of what happened in the 60s. I think what we take away from the lions of the civil rights movement is you take away principles from them. And you say, start where you are, try to make something sustainable. And I didn't try to go invent something massive. I just started where I was in a jazz quartet. And how can we bring that, how can we help New Orleans 1 gig at a time? So that was my way of taking away what happened in the 60s and applying it to my life. And I think we can all do that. I've been blessed beyond belief. I have great relationships and mentors with Uncle Andy. I've been over-financed, over-connected, all these things, right? And it's almost guilty not to take these lessons that we learn, whether it's from a book or a living legend, and not apply it to things that you're facing. So I encourage all of us to find our own civil rights movement, because we all find problems in the world. Can we find sustainable ways to solve that?
And go ahead.
Yeah, your problems are your opportunities.
Sure.
And the thing that impressed me about Martin Luther King most of all was that he wasn't interested in civil rights. He wanted to be a quiet preacher, and he left Atlanta to stay out of politics and action, and he chose Montgomery because he wanted to finish his doctoral dissertation. Well, 2 weeks after he finished his dissertation, Rosa Parks sat down in the front of the bus. Now, I think of that as part of a divine plan, that even though he was running from it, he ran into it. And I find my life has been that way too. I mean, people said, when did you decide to go to the UN, be a UN ambassador? And I said, I never did. In fact, I was playing tennis on in Lesotho, I think, with Donna Shalala, who's the president of University of Miami, and later became Secretary of Health and Human Services. And I got a call from WSB saying, they're calling you from Atlanta. They say you're going to be the United Nations ambassador. They said, come on to the phone. I said, no, tell them I'm playing tennis. I'm not thinking about, I'm not interested in any United Nations. This is some reporter just trying to get a quick story. And I really didn't pay any attention to it until I came back and Jimmy Carter said he needed me at the UN. I was trying to convince him that Barbara Jordan would be a much better United Nations ambassador. And he agreed. She was more talented and she was more articulate. She was a great speaker and lawyer, she said, but the one thing we need is somebody who was with Martin Luther King. And he said, that puts the job on you. Well, but it was not my intention. It was not my intention to run for Congress or mayor. When you're doing good one day at a time, good things happen to you. And my grandmama used to say, let the day's own trouble be sufficient unto the day thereof. Be not anxious for the morrow. And so I've never had a life plan. I've never had and that's what I try to tell him. Let it, cool it. Take it easy.
And you're speaking to him and his generation, where you say there needs to be a little bit more of the cooling of the jets, not being so overly anxious.
Don't be anxious. Most of the people who fail jump into things too quickly, and they force their hand, and when it's right, it works.
You mentioned about Rosa Parks, though. It was a 15-year-old teenager, Claudette Colvin, who sat down first. Right, in the back seat or the front seat of the bus. And we can say, we need to cool it, but oftentimes we're depending on young people for the energy. I think about Silicon Valley. It's not a mistake that people are young, they create YouTube and Google, and these young people are changing the world, one line of code at a time. So while it's true that we need to kind of take a big breath.
They were taking it very easy.
Yeah.
No, they were. I'm sure that all of these high-tech inventions have come out of people not working compulsively to find something. They get together and they're having fun, and they come up with something like Google. Mm-hmm. You got to be kind of goofy to think of that term. and that idea, Google, might actually be the basis of the revolution in China and the rest of the world. That I think, what would we have done if we'd had cell phones? You know, we didn't have cell phones. We were careful about our message because we knew we only had 3 minutes a day on the 6 o'clock news. There was 1 minute on ABC, 1 minute on CBS, and 1 minute on NBC. And if you didn't get it said in 30 seconds, it wasn't going to make it. But when we probably could not have succeeded with this kind of movement before television. So God only knows how we're going to come out of the present world situation. But what I say to Kabir is that everything you have done in life for fun or for work is going to be used in ways that you cannot plan or imagine. So do the best you can every day with whatever comes to you.
So this kind of intergenerational exchange right here is something you all engaged in all the time. And as we just saw right here, you don't necessarily see things exactly the same, but you come to the table willing to exchange these ideas. So among the areas that you explore in the book where you didn't necessarily see things the same way, marriage, relations, commitments,
that was a big one.
you know, how government is used. You want to begin with the marriage thing?
Yeah, I mean, I was at Uncle Andy's house, and we just kind of started talking about women and love, and he knows very well that I have no game when it comes to women.
Not true.
And, no, it's true. It's true. So he said, Kabir, there's this girl, and I want you to meet her. And I said, where is this girl? He said, well, she's down the road. She works at a marble factory. And so we got in the car, and he drove me down the road, and he introduced me to her. And he said to me on the side, he said, you know, if you put a sari on her, she would be a real knockout, right? She was doing her degree in psychiatry. We didn't really hit it off that much because I was not very talkative. And but he comes down on the belief that I come from an Indian tradition. And the whole idea is you have an arranged marriage, right? Your parents, your friends, they come together and make a selection for you. I'm resistant to that idea. I'm very resistant to that idea. But, you know.
And actually what I got out of that was, I said, you know one thing? I've almost had 2 arranged marriages. That I went to Marion, Alabama, because my conference superintendent said that there was a church that was falling in, and if they didn't get a pastor there this summer, it would probably close. And so I was one of your father's fans. And so I was planning to run with the Pioneer Track Club in New York, and I had a job, and I was thinking about the Olympics, and then he calls me and puts me on this guilt trip about this little country church, and I'm just getting religion, and when I got there, I saw this book, which was a Bible on the table. I looked around the living room and I saw a senior life savings certificate with this lady's name on it, this girl's name, Jean Childs. I said, who is this? This is my baby, my daughter. And then there was a basketball letter. And I said, you know, this the other daughter? No, same, my baby daughter's the athlete. And I said, and what about the Bible? Well, she's kind of religious too. Well, now, golly. To go down in the country and find, I was on Howard's swimming team and track team, and to find somebody who's interested in the Bible and is a good swimmer and and an athlete. Before I even met her, I said, the Lord sent me here for this wife. Now, what I didn't realize until I was talking with Kabir was that was not accidental. that Mrs. Childs had called Reverend Stanley, the superintendent, and said, you need to send a young preacher down here because I got these 3 beautiful daughters and I need to marry off one of them. See?
Hence arranged marriage.
But no, my mother is a member of the same church, and she called the same superintendent and said, can you please help me get my son out of New York? See, when I went into the ministry, my daddy didn't like it, so I hadn't been home for a year. And he said, we need him to come back to the South. And can you find him something to do closer to home? So here was my mother and my mother-in-law working through the same person. And I didn't really figure out that I had an arranged marriage until we started talking.
He did say also, another point of contention we have is that he wanted to marry someone who's younger, because a younger woman grows obliged to serve an older man.
Well, that was my
Maybe
second
because
marriage.
the life expectancy is longer for men?
No, I mean, I'm a pretty energetic 78-year-old. And Carol and I have been married 15 years just about. Well, if
14
you
and a
know,
half.
if I'd married somebody 74, I'd be taking care of her by now. But I wasn't thinking about age. I was really, that too was arranged by circumstances that neither of us seemed to control. So we're gonna get you. I tell you what I used to say to him. I said, look, an arranged marriage or some thoughtful input from family and friends is much better than picking up a girl in a happy hour or bumping into her in the gym, or maybe even going to church.
So Kabir, you have to feel very fortunate to have this relationship. Ambassador Young talks about how your own children, it's difficult to impart your life lessons to your own kids because they don't want to hear it. Your own kids or even your grandkids. And was it your kids who didn't even take you up on your offer of $1,000 to read your books?
Yeah.
So I
But
wonder,
that's the way it's supposed to be.
it's supposed to be that way.
It's supposed to be that one of the things children have to do is rebel against their parents' image of them. And my father wanted me to be a dentist and a baseball player. And that was all he could see. That wasn't my calling. And but they want to be protective. They didn't want me to go into the ministry because my daddy said ministers are all poor or crooked. And I don't want you to be either. But they didn't want me to work with Martin Luther King because I had a good job in New York, and if you want to see a good play, go see Pearl Cleage's play at the Alliance Theater. You see how the black bourgeoisie was sort of looking at, they had a life of their own in the sort of upper class black community while all the movement was going on. And I was born into that. See, and they didn't want me. They said there's nothing ever good is going to happen with this bunch of trifling young Baptist preachers. You got a good job in New York, you'll be secure. I had a home. Stay in New York. But marrying this little girl from Marion, Alabama, who was the same town Coretta came from, there was much more determination in them to come back to get into the struggle. So a house and a job didn't make any difference to them. They wanted to be in this struggle. And so we came back. And you have to resist your parents' overprotectiveness. And I
How
tend
do you do
to.
that? How do
I don't
you
know.
do
My
that?
children do a good job of it. Because I never wanted any of them to do what they're doing. But they're all doing what they ought to be doing, and they're doing it well, and they're loving it. But even in terms of the choices of schools and, jobs and well.
Yeah.
And so you felt pretty comfortable with, hearing your own voice and saying, I'm going this direction, especially after hearing those words of advice.
Sure, and I was the same way with my grandfather. He was a science advisor to the government of India, and he wrote an autobiography, and I really didn't read it until he had passed away. And I find that parents are there, they want to protect you, and they want to comfort you. And it was okay to get some criticism from someone outside your circle, and that was Uncle Andy, and he encouraged me to criticize him. And your last question about...
He was your guru.
Yeah. I heard the other day guru stands for, what was it? Good for nothing or something? No, a lot of knowledge, relatively useless, something like this. But Uncle Andy's been like an outside voice for me, and we disagree on things. And that's been the great kind of challenge. We agree to disagree. We disagreed about music. He's kind of a mentee, a mentor not just to me, but to T.I., to rappers all over the Southeast and across America. And I don't agree with some of their music. In fact, I was sitting on a plane with a rapper next to me, and his name was Akon. I didn't know who it was. I called him Acorn. And I asked him, I said, well, can I ask you a question? He said, yeah, let me ask me a question. I said, you have so much money, and you're so successful and so popular. Why are you so angry about it? And he just said, this is how we do it. This is the tradition of hip-hop. This is a way of life. And I asked Uncle Andy about that. He says, I'm glad we have angry young rappers. And I said, why? And this is a point of disagreement. And he said, well, in other countries, where do the young malcontents go? They go and they'll go become part of in Pakistan, where they go become part of a Wahhabi or madrasa, and they learn the root of all evil is America. But at least in America, people can rap about music, rap about their problems, and a generation later, who's the investor in the New Jersey Nets? It's Jay-Z. These people get wealthy, and they reinvest back in the community. And my disagreement there is that... Some of them. Yeah, my disagreement there is, there's a big difference between that and, I use the example of jazz music when you say, I'm looking really lonely right now, and I feel like I'm looking down that lonesome road. And people might say, wow, Kabir seems kind of pathetic, and I went to a book signing today. But if I were to sing those same words to you over blues music, you might feel that the music is uplifting, but the lyrics are down and out. And you feel through the blues, you get rid of the blues. So we had a conversation over rap and art and culture. Dr. Joyce Wilson, who's, you're here, right? She's been teaching this book in her classes, and she's having a lot of her students look at hip-hop and how this can be used as a form for leadership. So maybe you want to explain why you believe...
Yeah, I think one of the liberal mistakes of my generation was the restrictions put on the welfare system, where it was, in order to get aid for dependent children, you could not stay with your grandparents. You couldn't keep a man in the house. It was almost that by government policy, we broke up the black family. Slavery didn't break up the black family as much as liberal government policy. But it wasn't. It was a liberal idea with a whole lot of conservative, anti-liberal amendments that created a disaster when, in our school kids, their mothers are 17, and their grandmothers are 35, and they're uprooted. It was a combination of urbanization, people growing up in rural areas, moving to the cities with no family structure, no value structure. The amazing thing is that the church has adapted as well as it did. That was another thing. He didn't particularly like the mega churches. But the mega churches are the ones that have reached out to try to have something for everybody. But the kids who are left there on the street started rapping about it. And at first it was very political. Well, when you're a teenager, politics and sex get all confused. And so it becomes very vile and very hostile. But I take the position that that's a sort of a musical psychiatry. That by singing about a lot of this stuff, and I mean the old low-down dirty blues that I grew up on in New Orleans, my mother just was, I mean, she scratched up the records when I brought them in the house. But by that time, I knew all the words. And there are all these teenage rituals. Remember when everybody hated the Beatles? I mean, there's stages that we go through. And I think that I've had enough confidence in the freedom and the justice and the educational opportunity and also the strong culture of freedom, which is America, that given time, these kids will grow up and they are smart as they can be. Talking to teachers who taught them in school, they were really kids who were too bright for the schools they were in. Schools were overcrowded. They didn't have any support system at home. And then again, one of my life lessons was getting put out of school in 3rd grade. And the boy that I got put out of school with never got back to school. And I saw him when I was thinking about dropping out of Howard and joining the Army just before my senior year. And he came to the swimming pool high on heroin and almost drowned. And then he recognized me and reminded me that we'd gotten put out of school together in 3rd grade. He had not been back to school a single day. He'd been in and out of every reform school and penitentiary in Louisiana. And it was obvious that and he said to me, you know, I'm as smart as you. If I'd had the opportunities you're having, I wouldn't screw them up like you're doing it. And I mean, it was a moment of truth. And he said to me, he said, you know, you have to go back to school. And you have to get an education, and you have to figure out a way to help people like me. Because, you know, I shouldn't have been in jail all my life. And one of the reasons I'm always partial to these kids who are dropped out or pushed out is that they are victims of a lot of things in our society that we don't understand and really don't come in contact with very much anymore. But they are genuine, intelligent, concerned human beings that have just never found the tools and the support to be full participants in our society.